Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. We're diving straight into something specific revealed by the sources you've brought us today. A particular practice happening in Morocco when someone reports an assault or an accident.
That's right. The core issue, really, is that victims, people who've been harmed, are often required by the police to first go and get a medical certificate.
Right.
And this certificate needs to estimate something specific called ITT before they can, properly file their complaint.
And the sources you've got really dig into why this happens, so, I mean, from the police viewpoint, but also the significant problems it causes for the person actually trying to report something traumatic.
Exactly.
And also what the law actually says about it. And crucially, a pretty critical analysis of whether this practice even makes sense, if it's effective or fair.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that maybe on the surface sounds like procedure, but reading through this, you see it can be incredibly frustrating, maybe even, unsettling for someone who's already been harmed.
Absolutely. It puts the burden back on them. So our mission today is to, navigate these sources together, look at all the angles of this practice, the reasons given for it, the actual experience of the victim, the legal side, or maybe the lack of a clear legal side, and that expert critique. Let's get into it.
So let's picture the scene the sources describe. You've just been through something awful, maybe an assault, maybe a car accident. You go to the police station. You want to report it, right? Get something started.
And what often happens, according to these sources, isn't that they immediately take down all the details for a formal complaint. Instead, you might be told, look, you need to come back.
Come back later. Like when?
Could be hours later, maybe the next day, if it happens on a Friday night. Maybe not till Monday.
Wow. Okay. And you can't just show up empty-handed when you return.
No, that's the key. You need to bring back a specific document, that medical certificate we mentioned.
Right.
And it's crucial, the sources stress, that this certificate includes an estimate of the ITT.
ITT. Remind us what that stands for.
Incapacité total temporaire. It's the doctor's estimation of temporary total incapacity. Basically, how many days are you likely unable to perform your normal daily activities because of the injury sustained?
Okay, so that number, that ITT estimate, is really important for the police. Why do they need that specific piece of information up front, according to the sources?
Well, the sources lay out a few reasons the police apparently give. Number one is evaluating the bodily harm. That ITT figure is seen as like the main way to gauge how serious the physical injuries are.
Okay.
And this assessment is critical because it directly affects how the incident is classified legally. Is it just a minor infraction, a contravention? Is it a délit, like a misdemeanor? Or is it a serious crime? That classification determines the whole procedure that follows.
I see. So it's about getting that medical input right away to sort of triage the case legally, put it in the right box from the start.
That seems to be the logic presented, yes. Another reason cited is that it functions as initial proof. The certificate is meant to be a concrete evidence that injuries actually exist and potentially connect them to the incident the victim is reporting.
Like a first piece of objective paperwork documenting the damage.
Sort of, yeah. And thirdly, it's often presented as just plain necessary for the legal procedures themselves, especially if they're going to pursue criminal charges related to physical harm. The argument seems to be that without this medical assessment, the prosecutor can't really decide how to proceed, or even if they can proceed.
Okay, so it's framed almost like a key that unlocks the formal justice system for these kinds of injuries.
That's how it's presented in the sources, yeah. And they also hint at maybe a less official reason, something more about internal workflow.
Like what?
Organization of services. The idea is that maybe requiring this certificate is a way for police stations to manage their caseload. Perhaps it filters out cases with very minor or maybe no visible injuries, pushing the processing of those down the line a bit.
Right, sort of a gatekeeping function, maybe unintentionally or intentionally. Okay, so that covers the administrative rationale, the stated purpose.
Yeah.
But let's flip it. What about the person who's just been hurt? What problems does this requirement create for them, according to the critique in your sources?
Yeah, this is where the sources really focus on the negative impact. The biggest issue is just the delay and the sheer stress it adds on to someone who's already vulnerable, already traumatized.
I can imagine.
Think about it. You've just been attacked or you're shaken from an accident, and you're told your first step isn't actually reporting the crime fully, but go find a doctor. Maybe you need a specific type of doctor, a forensic one. Maybe they're far away. Maybe it's late at night. It just adds this huge layer of stress and delay.
It really does feel like being given an assignment when you're injured and just trying to get help. Not exactly supportive.
Not at all. And it's not just the hassle, there's the cost factor too.
Yeah.
Getting this certificate isn't usually free. So you're putting an immediate financial burden on the victim.
Another barrier. And does this delay, waiting to get the certificate, does it affect the actual investigation?
Critically, yes. The sources are quite clear on this. There's a real risk of losing evidence.
How so?
Well, physical evidence on the victim's body or clothes might be lost, washed away, or just deteriorate over time. And eyewitnesses, their memories can fade or become less reliable if there's a big gap between the event and when the police actually start digging into it formally, which might only happen after the certificate is produced.
That makes complete sense. You want things fresh, right?
Absolutely. And then there's the psychological impact the sources mention. For the victim, knowing that the police aren't immediately taking full action, that they have to go do this other thing first,
Yeah.
it can create this really awful feeling that the person who harmed them has this sort of window of impunity.
Like justice is paused right out of the gate.
Exactly. And one last point the sources raise is about unequal access. Getting to a doctor quickly, affording it, maybe finding that specific forensic doctor if needed. That's not equally easy for everyone. It depends a lot on where you are, your resources. It creates an uneven playing field.
So, okay, despite the police's stated reasons about procedure and evidence, this practice seems to pile on practical, financial, and psychological obstacles, plus potential investigative issues. Given all that, you'd think there must be a really clear legal basis for this requirement. What do the sources actually say about Moroccan law here?
Well, this is probably one of the most striking findings in the sources. They state pretty clearly that Moroccan law does not explicitly require a victim to bring a medical certificate before they can file their initial complaint.
Wait, seriously, the law doesn't say you must have this piece of paper to start the process.
Apparently not for that very first step of filing, according to these sources. They point specifically to Article 22 of the Code of Criminal Procedure.
What does that say?
It's pretty straightforward. Something like, any person who claims to be injured by a crime or misdemeanor can file a complaint before the competent judicial police officers. The right to file seems based on your claim you were injured, not on presenting proof at that exact moment.
Wow. Okay, that's a huge discrepancy then. If the law doesn't mandate it for filing, where does this police practice actually come from? Why is it happening?
The sources suggest it's likely not about a strict legal prerequisite for the initial complaint. It seems to be more rooted in internal administrative instructions, maybe procedures focused on billing a complete file right away, or perhaps it's just become an established habit,
Sort of, this is how we do things situation.
Possibly. Stemming from those organizational or initial evidence ideas we talked about, even if the letter of the law for filing the complaint doesn't strictly demand the certificate right at step one.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So less a legal wall, maybe more of an internal procedural preference, which actually leads us perfectly into the source's critical analysis. They really take apart those police arguments, don't they?
They absolutely do. This is where the sources step back and ask, is this systematic requirement actually effective? Is it even relevant in many cases? Let's look at those police reasons again, but through this critical lens.
Okay, sounds good. First up, the certificate is needed for evaluation of bodily harm for legal qualification. How does the critique challenge that?
Well, the sources point out a major limitation. The certificate often isn't very helpful, especially if the harm isn't physical or isn't visible.
Like, say, verbal threats or psychological trauma.
Exactly. In those cases, a doctor's certificate might just say, no objective physical lesions found, which tells you very little about the actual harm or the impact on the victim. And the sources also make the point that doctors aren't usually psychologists, so any notes on psychological impact are probably just based on what the victim tells them, making it more like suppositions rather than objective assessment.
So for a lot of types of harm, the certificate is either kind of useless or just repeats what the victim says anyway.
Pretty much. It only really works well for a specific kind of visible physical injury. Okay, second argument. Initial proof and establishing the link with the aggression or accident.
Right. How strong is that link if the victim just walks into a doctor's office later?
That's exactly the weakness the critique highlights. The sources emphasize that usually when a victim goes to the doctor on their own, the doctor just records the injuries they see and notes down the victim's story about how they happened. The doctor isn't investigating. They don't formally establish that causal link.
Okay, so the certificate proves the injury exists and it records what the victim claims caused it, but it's not independent proof that the reported incident actually caused that injury.
Precisely. And the sources argue this reliance on the victim's unverified statement actually opens the door to potential misuse or even false reports. It significantly lowers the certificate's inherent value as standalone evidence.
Interesting.
They do contrast this, though, with a situation where, say, an ambulance brings the victim straight from an accident scene. In that case, the context provides a much stronger connection.
That makes sense. The circumstances really matter for how much weight the certificate carries regarding causation, which leads to the third police argument: necessity of the document for the judge to follow up.
Yeah, and given what we just discussed, the sources basically ask, how necessary can it really be? If the certificate doesn't definitively prove how the injury occurred in relation to the incident.
Right, if it doesn't rule out, say, an old injury or even something self-inflicted.
Exactly. Then how can it be essential for the judge? Just having a certificate with an ITT number doesn't automatically validate the victim's entire story about the cause.
Okay, I get it. The certificate confirms the injury's severity, the ITT, but not necessarily the narrative behind it.
Correct. The sources argue its real evidential power only comes when it's backed up by other evidence gathered during the investigation, things like witness statements, physical findings from the scene, anything that corroborates the victim's account and links the injury to the specific event they reported.
So on its own, it's not that strong. It needs support.
That's the argument. And finally, that fourth potential reason, managing overflowing police services, the workload argument.
The sources didn't seem too convinced by that one either.
No, they're quite direct. The critique essentially says, look, just pushing work from the police onto the health services, which are often also overloaded, doesn't really solve anything logically.
Yeah.
It just burdens doctors and hospitals with extra administrative tasks, potentially taking time away from actual patient care. And it doesn't necessarily make the overall justice system any more efficient. It just moves the bottleneck somewhere else.
So it might not even fix the capacity problem, just shifts it and potentially creates inefficiencies in healthcare too.
That's the critique in a nutshell. So to sum it up, the sources really dismantle the idea that requiring the certificate upfront is automatically effective, necessary, or fair. They point out its limited use in many cases, its low standalone proof value, the risk it doesn't really prevent fraud, like claiming old injuries, and the fact it puts an inappropriate burden on health services.
It really sounds like, based on these sources, this practice, whatever its intentions, ends up creating significant hurdles and might even undermine the quality and fairness of the justice process itself.
That's the strong takeaway from the analysis presented. It can look like a procedural shortcut that ends up prioritizing an administrative step over the victim's immediate need to report and the importance of starting a swift, thorough investigation right away.
So if you, the listener, find yourself in this really difficult situation in Morocco, faced with this requirement, what can you actually do?
Yeah.
The sources offer some practical advice, right?
Yes, thankfully they do provide some actionable steps. First, and maybe most importantly, insist on filing the complaint right then and there.
Don't just accept being sent away.
Exactly. Remind them, politely but firmly, of your right under Article 22 to file a complaint based on your claim of being injured. You can state that you will provide the medical certificate later if it's deemed necessary for the file, but the initial report needs to be taken now.
Okay, stand your ground on the right to file immediately. What else?
Second, always request a receipt or some kind of official proof that you were there and that you initiated a complaint or attempted to. Get it documented.
Get evidence that you reported it. Good tip.
Third, if possible, consult a lawyer. An attorney can give you crucial advice on your rights, help you understand the process, and can even liaise with the police for you if things get difficult.
Yeah, legal backup seems key when you hit procedural roadblocks like this.
And finally, the sources suggest reaching out to victim support associations. These groups can be invaluable, offering not just potential legal help, but also vital psychological support, which is so important when you're dealing with trauma and bureaucracy.
Those are really concrete, empowering things someone can do. The sources also touched on an alternative approach the police could take, right? Something different from this upfront certificate demand.
Yes, they did. The alternative proposed is basically that the police should register the complaint immediately when the victim comes in. Start the preliminary investigation right away.
Get the ball rolling first.
Exactly. And then, based on the specifics of the case, what the victim reports, what the initial findings are, they decide if a medical examination and certificate are actually needed to objectively assess physical damage.
So it becomes a decision made during the investigation based on need, rather than a mandatory first step for everyone regardless of circumstance.
Precisely. The sources conclude that part by really calling for procedures that are clearer, more focused on the victim's actual needs, and that prioritize immediate reception and assistance when someone reports harm.
This has been a really thorough exploration of this specific practice in Morocco, all drawn from the sources you provided. We started with, understanding the what's and the why from the police side, then delved into the very real difficulties this creates for victims.
Yeah, the human cost.
Then clarified the legal picture, which seems quite different from the practice, went deep into that critical analysis, questioning its effectiveness and fairness, and finally landed on practical advice and potential alternatives.
It really does show you the complexity hidden in what looks like a simple administrative requirement. You see the clash between maybe perceived bureaucratic logic and the actual human impact, the gap between legal rights on paper and how things work on the ground, and just how important it is to critically examine these established procedures.
It certainly paints a very detailed picture of this particular issue using the material provided. And it leaves us, and you the listener, with a question to think about. When systems are set up to handle reports of harm, how can they best balance that administrative need for proof and process with the immediate rights and, frankly, the vulnerability of people seeking justice right after something terrible has happened?
It's a tough balance.
Does a practice like demanding this certificate up front truly make the system more efficient or just? Or could it, maybe inadvertently, be creating barriers that actually undermine the very justice it's supposed to support?
A fundamental